I'm going to spend some time today talking about some of the basic features of political economy in Iran, and I will start you off with some historical backgrounds. To gloss over a whole lot of historical detail that isn't strictly necessary for the AP Compco, of course, I'm going to divide this into two phases. One is under the Pahlavi dynasty, the Shahs who were leading Iran for the 50 years before the Iranian Revolution, and then the second is the after the Iranian Revolution. So, under the Pahlavis, with some major exceptions when the country is embroiled in World War II, the basic trend is state led economic development. In this period, the state is going to make a conscious decision to promote economic modernization. And so they're going to spend money on infrastructure, building roads, building railroads. They're going to sponsor the creation of some state dominated monopolies in industries like textiles and foods. They're in particular going to try and emphasize the creation of industries that can supply demand domestically instead of having Iran rely on imports from elsewhere. They're going to expand education. That's a particular hallmark of the White Revolution in the 1960s. And in general, they are going to attempt to protect domestic industry against foreign competition. And this should sound a little bit familiar if you have thought about the history of any other economically developing country. One important factor that enables Iran to go through these modernizing reforms and to pay for all this stuff is oil revenue. Oil has been known in Iran for more than 100 years, but the extraction initially mostly benefits a British company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the predecessor of today's BP. And it's not until really the 1950s and 60s that Iran begins to benefit from, begins to be the primary beneficiary of its own oil revenues. And then in 1973, Iran will finally take direct control of its own oil fields. So Iran does not reap the entire benefit of exporting its oil throughout this period, but oil revenues are going to increase over the course of the Shah's rule, and they're going to finance a good deal of this reform. The results of all of these reforms are mixed. On the one hand, Iran does experience significant industrialization and really considerable economic growth, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s. Iran's going to succeed in shifting from a overwhelmingly agricultural economy to a country where there is a great deal of manufacturing happening. Attendant on that is a significant increase in urbanization, partly because people are drawn to work in factory jobs, and partly because some of the land reforms that came as part of the White Revolution effectively made it difficult for some peasants to survive in the countryside and forced them to migrate to the cities in search of work. However, on the flip side, there's a significant amount of social instability that results from all of these economic reforms, as is generally the case when things change a lot in a short period of time. In particular, we've already talked about these peasants who are suddenly displaced from their ancestral homelands and suddenly find themselves in these new and unfamiliar cities doing very different work than what they're accustomed to. In addition, the clergy, the religious elite in Iran, own a great deal of the most fertile farmland prior to the Shah's land reforms in the 1960s. And so they too have their pocketbooks hurt by the redistribution of land to farmers. And so the consequence is that there's some economic as well as some ideological and religious and political factors which are going to contribute to people's willingness to participate in the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So it shouldn't actually be a huge surprise then that one of the stated ideals of the Iranian Revolution and one of the emphases in the constitution that goes into force in 1979 is to get the state to care more for the poor. And you'll find a few different clauses in Iran's constitution which explicitly commit the state to provide a variety of social welfare services, although it's questionable whether the state is doing an excellent job of that today. In addition, after the revolution, you're going to see some number of elites leave the country and flee Iran. And some of those private businesses are going to be nationalized. The state is going to retain control of oil. The state is going to retain control of what had previously been state-owned industries. And then there are other industries that are going to be renationalized. So in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the state's influence in the economy is only going to increase. One other unique effect of the revolution is the creation of these institutions called bunyads. Bunyads are described as parastatal foundations. I think you can probably find that phrasing in your textbook. The word parastatal is kind of a weird way of just saying they're sort of state-owned, but not necessarily directly operated by the state or directly accountable to the state. The way that this works is that in the aftermath of the revolution, the revolutionaries are going to confiscate a significant number of assets that had previously belonged belong to the Shah and to the royal family. And they're going to hand them over, they're going to create these bunyads, these foundations, and hand those assets over to those foundations and essentially say, please administer these resources in a way that will allow you to perform this charitable work that we have said the revolution ought to secure. So there are now bunyads whose nominal purpose is to help former prisoners of war, to help the families of people who died in the Iran-Iraq War, to help people with disabilities, to help alleviate rural poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of these institutions are attached to very worthy-sounding charitable causes. But in the decades since the revolution, what has effectively happened is that these institutions have accumulated significant amounts of assets and significant shares of Iran's economic activity. They're not just sitting around having money, they're actually performing significant economic activities. And they're doing that in a way that is not necessarily accountable to the state. Most of these foundations are in the control of various religious authorities in keeping with their status as charitable institutions. Some of them are actually directly controlled by the Revolutionary Guard. And so the function of these foundations today is maybe partly to perform that charitable work, but also to be a significant source of wealth and therefore power for a variety of interests in Iran that tend towards the more conservative theocratic side of Iranian politics. So, let's turn to some key challenges that the Iranian economy faces today. Number one, and you could probably expect this because we talk so much about the resource curse in this class, is dependence on oil. Oil's now nationalized and was since before the revolution under the control of an institution called the National Iranian Oil Company. The figures will fluctuate, but these data are from 2018 and 19. In that year, oil accounted for 18% of Iran's gross domestic product and about a quarter of its government revenue. And it's worth noting that economic sanctions on Iran were a little bit different than they are today. The dependence on oil means that Iran has to do a significant amount of exporting in order to profit from that resource. And this in turn is going to make it vulnerable to international sanctions, which I'll talk about a little bit today, and I'll talk about a little bit when we get to Iran's foreign policy in a different lecture video. In other words, if the rest of the world is not willing to buy Iran's oil, if political authorities try and sanction Iran and put an embargo on Iran's oil exports, then that's going to make it difficult for Iran to actually make use of this vast natural resource. Second issue, as I've already highlighted, is that bunyads control a lot of sectors of the economy, in drug manufacturing, in construction, in food production, in housing, but they're not very transparent. They don't pay very much tax, and they're really not directly accountable to the government. And so they function, as I've said, to provide revenue to various parts of the clergy, to provide some revenue to the Revolutionary Guard, without directly benefiting Iran's more democratic state institutions in a major way. Iran suffers from pretty high unemployment. Officially, the unemployment rate is around 11% overall, although it's possible that that's an understatement. And it's particularly notable that unemployment is really high among young people. For people under 24, the unemployment rate is 30%. It's even worse than that for women. It's even worse than that for people with university degrees. And one consequence of that ability of Iranian citizens to get an education, but not to get a job that matches their educational credentials, is what is colloquially known as brain drain, which is that well-educated citizens leave Iran in fairly large numbers in order to try and find economic opportunities that are not available to them in Iran. Finally, and helping to explain a number of the challenges that I've just listed is the specter of economic sanctions, which have been hanging over Iran's head to some degree or another basically since the revolution. Sanctions are restrictions on trade imposed by countries or by international organizations. Countries might sanction individuals, they might sanction specific sectors of the economy, they might sanction specific companies, or they might just impose a blanket embargo on trade with any country. And Iran has, for the last 40-some years, faced pretty extensive sanctions as an effect of what the United States and other countries perceive as its support of terrorism, and as a result of its development of nuclear weapons. So the US has imposed sanctions on Iran almost continuously since 1979. There was a brief blip on the radar where sanctions were lifted in the early 1980s, but they rapidly went back because Iran was spending money supporting a variety of militant groups elsewhere in the Middle East that the United States considers terrorist organizations. The United Nations put sanctions on Iran in 2006 for failing to comply with its various commitments under international treaties, to not develop nuclear weapons. The European Union has sanctioned Iran for its nuclear program as well, and also for a variety of human rights violations. So, long story short, Iran is significantly hampered in its ability to export goods to participate in the international economy. And it's just worth noting that even as other countries have potentially relaxed their sanctions on Iran, we'll talk about that when we get to Iran's nuclear program. American sanctions alone, even if the United States were the only country imposing sanctions on Iran, would still have a significant effect because a lot of those American sanctions are so called secondary sanctions, which apply to any business that does business with Iran. So there are a lot of banks, even not headquartered in the United States, for instance, that will take a second look at a business deal involving the Iranian state or an Iranian company because they fear that they will run afoul of American sanctions and then be unable to do business in the United States. So, why does this matter for Iran's economy and politics? A variety of reasons. Number one, sanctions make it harder for Iran to sell oil. In the description of this video, you can find a link to some statistical information about the quantifiable impact of sanctions on Iran's economy. And one of the things that you'll see is that Iran's oil exports are going to go down. It's also harder for Iran to retrieve money that it's already supposed to have from the oil that it's already sold to countries that aren't participating in the sanctions regime, because often that money is held in bank accounts that are subject to American secondary sanctions or to UN or EU sanctions. Another consequence has been just overall reduced economic growth. High unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. The state has suffered because, as I've said, the state is fairly dependent on oil for a significant chunk of its budget. And so Iran's ability to spend money on stuff that it wants to do is diminished as a result of sanctions. It's also more difficult for Iran to attract foreign direct investment. So international investors are largely unwilling or unable to operate in Iran as a result of the sanctions that would threaten their business elsewhere if they opened up a factory or an enterprise in Iran. Finally, sanctions are never 100% enforceable. And so a final consequence of sanctions has been an increase in black market activity, in smuggling, in illegally importing goods and exporting goods in Iran. And one political effect of that shift is that the Revolutionary Guard tends to benefit from black market activity, from smuggling, because it controls port infrastructure, it controls border crossings, and therefore has more of an opportunity to corruptly profit from smuggling goods illegally in violation of those sanctions. I will leave it there. And just a final note that a lot of these sanctions hinge on Iran's nuclear program, which I agree. I know that I haven't said anything about today, but I promise it is in the foreign policy lecture. That's it. Thanks.